Well, good morning. I'm so glad that you guys are here today. Before we get into it, I just have to share one thing that I've observed, okay? I would say that I'm a pretty observant person. My wife would say that that is a lie. She would not agree with me, so you can pick which side you're on. But I've spent a lot of time with Jeremy, our student director. We work in Inside Out, our student environment together. We spent a lot of time together, so I've learned some of his tendencies, right? Several weeks ago, he started off one of his messages by showing a picture of chocolate chip cookies, by saying that he loves chocolate chip cookies. And what happens next? Everyone brings him chocolate chip cookies. Okay? So that's just one, all right? Before that, we were in a series called Unhooked, a series about temptation. If you haven't heard it yet, go check it out online. It's an incredible series. But in that series, Jeremy used a lot of images of deep sea fishing. And he shared that he loves deep sea fishing. And so what happens the next week? He's invited to go deep sea fishing. Okay? So I'm not telling you what to do. Just as some inspiration, I love the Atlanta Braves. And I love going to Braves games. That is what I love. You can do with that information what you will. But on a serious note, my name is Brandon, and if we haven't had the chance to meet yet, I would love to meet and get to know you. I'm on staff here at Wiregrass, and this is my wife, Casey. She is great. In fact, you probably see Casey a lot more than you see me around here. She was up here this morning doing a fantastic job leading us in worship. Casey is my best friend. She's the love of my life, my greatest supporter, and also the one who reminds me to roll out the trash can to the road on Sunday night, or it probably won't happen if we're being honest. But so that is us. We got married just under 2 years ago, and pretty quickly we moved up to Atlanta, started our married journey living there. We're both born and raised here in Dothan. And it didn't take very long for us to realize that Dothan is our home. And Dothan is where we love to be, and Dothan is where we wanted to be. So we sat down, we were living in Atlanta, and we looked at what it would look like to make our way back here. And so one thing I told Casey was, if we're going to do this thing, if we really are going to move back here, I want to lock it down. I want to be here for the long haul. So one of our early goals was buying a house. And luckily, in this crazy market that we're in, I still don't know how it happened. It was all kind of a blur, but we were able to lock this beauty down back in December when the market was crazy. We bought it at that time of year. And you know this, when you buy your first house, maybe you're on your second or third house at this point, but everyone remembers their first house. And this, our first house, one of the things that we're most excited about, and all of us when we buy our first houses, we're most excited about this part, the house itself. What we are going to do to the house to make it truly feel like a home and not just another house. So we put furniture in it, we customized it the way we wanted to. In fact, just this past week, we finally hung our first pictures on the wall. You know that fear of poking holes in the wall for a first time in a brand new home. But that is what we did. We're starting to make it our own, and that is so exciting. But you know this, when you buy your first home, you don't always think about this part of the home. The landscaping, the lawn, the shrubs, making it look great. And let me just throw this disclaimer out there. We bought our house in December in the dead of winter. Our grass today is a lot greener than it is in this picture, so please don't judge us. We're working hard. We're learning a lot about fertilizing and mowing, edging, all the things. And another thing, when you buy your first house, one of the things that you pray for and you hope for is that you just have great neighbors. You know what I mean? And I can tell you, Casey and I have an incredible neighbor. We have incredible neighbors on all sides of us, actually. We're really blessed and lucky in that way. But something interesting happened one day. I was in the house and I got a knock on the door. I open it and it's my neighbor. And so we just started talking for a little bit, and I could tell that he was doing yard work. He seemed like he was doing yard work. And he looked at my lawn and he said, "Hey, do you mind if I spray some of those weeds in your yard. And, I will admit it was a busy season, so I wasn't taking care of it as well as I should. But my first response was like, absolutely, go for it. That's more work for you, but you go for it. Don't hold back. So I let him go for it. He was doing his thing. I went back in the house, and about 15 seconds later, man, you'll get it, my man brain kicked in. And I said, he just insulted my lawn. He just insulted my lawn. And I was a little offended for a second. But I guess in his mind, he looked at those weeds and he thought that those weeds that are in my yard would take root and take over his yard, right? And maybe you felt the same thing about your neighbor. I don't know. But I guess that he was thinking that my weeds would take root and take over his yard. Well, if you've joined us over the past few weeks, you know that we're in this series called Kudzu. And kudzu is known as the most invasive plant on the planet. We know about kudzu that it will take root where it is and take over that whole area. We see it in the South more than anywhere. And a lot like my neighbor thinking that the weeds are going to take root in his yard and take over his yard, we have different things in our lives that take root in our heart and take over our lives and our families. They take over our homes. And eventually we even see it take over the world around us. And a couple weeks ago, Powell talked about bitterness and how bitterness can take root in our hearts and take over our lives. And then last week, he talked about how self-centeredness, this attitude and this mindset of being self-centered, me first, that kind of an attitude could take root and take over our lives. And we're continuing on in this theme of talking about different emotions, different feelings, different mindsets that so easily and so quickly take root in our hearts and take over our lives. And this morning, we're talking about one that we're all too familiar with, and that's fear. Fear. Maybe for you, something that you fear is the fear of flying, like being in an airplane. Well, that scares you. Maybe the fear of heights or the fear of being alone, or maybe with all the activity in the Gulf this summer that the sharks in there, that scares you to death. You don't want to go to the beach. We all have something that we're afraid of. That is one of the things that connects us as human beings. That we all have something we're afraid of. And now decades of research and scientific research will tell us that there are really 4 different responses to fear. And there's a lot of great information online about that. But one of the things that I've learned in being married to Casey is I've really learned how we react to fear. And we are actually really different in the way that we react to fear. In one way, Casey is more of the freeze type. When she's afraid, she freezes up. And maybe you can relate with that. Now, me, on the other hand, when I'm afraid, I fight. And a lot of times my words and my actions don't move too quickly for my thoughts. And maybe you've been there. Practically speaking, what this looks like for me and Casey is when we experience fear, what I see is that Casey reacts in more of a quiet manner. She gets more reserved. She is a little bit more frozen physically, and she's processing. She's thinking a whole lot, and she's figuring out how to overcome this or how to move past this. But when she is processing, she tends to process internally. And now me, on the other hand, I could not be more different. For me, when I'm afraid, I get loud. I start spewing at the mouth. I react. And my processing, you can tell everything I'm thinking when I'm afraid because I process externally. And maybe you can relate to one of us. We saw this happen in tax season. We learned a lot in tax season, and I was kind of the one who was filing and organizing our stuff. And what I noticed is I got home one day, and Casey had just gotten the mail, and she's standing at the counter, and she's frozen, holding a piece of mail. And I could tell, I knew her well enough at that point that she was afraid. And so what do I start doing? I start spewing at the mouth. I start asking a million questions like, what's going on? What's wrong? What's wrong? Is there anything I can do? Well, I move closer and I grab the piece of paper that she's holding, and she's still standing there like she's holding it, and I'm holding it, and I read it, and it is a bill for $500. And I'm already wondering in tax season, like, where are we going to come up with $500 for a bill? And so I start asking questions like, what did you do? What did you spend? What did you buy? What did I do? I don't know. Well, it didn't take a whole lot longer for me to realize that this was spam mail. And that's another lesson we're learning, is that there's real mail and then there's spam mail. And it can be really hard to tell the two apart. But that was a moment where Casey and I saw how we both react to fear. And you have very legitimate fears in your life that you react to. Maybe for you, it's the fear of the unknown. Maybe you are a scheduler, you're a planner, your calendar is your best friend, and then something pops up out of the unknown, and it shakes you because you weren't prepared for it. And then it causes you to ask a question in the future. You're like, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? Will I be okay? And the fear of the unknown is something that gets you. Or maybe for others of you, it's the fear of finances, that you look at your budget and you wonder how you're going to make it through the month. You look at the groceries you need and you see that prices are just astronomical. We get it, right? And we wonder how we're going to make it through the month, or how we're going to let our kid play that sport or do that thing that they want to do, because everything costs money. That's a fear that you have. For others of you, it's the fear of missing out, right? We call this FOMO, not being included or not being invited in or looped into something that shakes you. That makes you nervous, it makes you afraid even. And for others of you, it's the fear of not being enough. And when you saw this pop up on the screen, you saw that blank and your mind automatically filled in that blank for you. I don't have to do that. Because you've heard it said at some point in your life that you're not good enough, and you're not smart enough, and you're not experienced enough. And that fear of not being enough ultimately turns into a fear of failure that keeps you from doing anything at all. And I would venture to say that none of us want to live life like that. So the question that at this point you're probably asking yourself, the question that I ask myself all the time is how? How do we keep fear from taking over? How do we keep fear from becoming one of those things that takes root in our hearts and takes over our lives and our families and our homes and our world? Well, this morning, we're going to look at a story in the Old Testament, and it's a story that maybe you grew up hearing, maybe you've never heard of it, but at least you've probably heard of the title of the story in sports analogies, right? And it's this story of David versus Goliath. And it's a story where you hear the title and you already kind of know the two main characters, David and Goliath. But this morning, I want to challenge our understanding of this story. I want to challenge the idea that maybe it's not just David versus the giant of Goliath. What if this is the story of David versus two giants? David versus the giant of Goliath, but also David versus the giant of fear. If you haven't read this story, I encourage you to go home this evening, read it on your own, read it with your family. It's a fascinating story. We're going to read snippets of the story, and as we read, we're actually going to learn three things about the giant of fear. The giant of fear that pops up in this story, but the giant of fear that also pops up in our lives. And so we begin in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 8. It says, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel. To kind of set the scene, essentially, the Israelites are on this side, and they're led by this guy named King Saul, right? And the Philistines are over here, and they've got this warrior named Goliath. What we know about Goliath is he was about 9 foot tall. He was carrying around about 150 pounds of armor, and we know that he was intimidating. In fact, That was a military strategy that the Philistines used. They sent their biggest, strongest, scariest guy up to the front to challenge the armies that they came across. And so Goliath is strong, Goliath is big, and Goliath is scary. So he comes forward to instill fear in the Israelite army. And it works. And see that Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel. And this kind of shows us the first thing that's true about the giant of fear. And it's that fear is loud. And for you, when you've experienced the giant of fear, you know that it doesn't just gently come up to you. It gets in your face, it shouts, and it scares you. It's terrifying. And so we read on to see how Goliath put fear into the minds of the Israelite army. He says, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." We continue, and it says, "If he is able to fight and kill me," and this is an ultimatum. Essentially what Goliath does here is he says, look, this whole thing, it doesn't have to be a bloodbath. We don't have to shed a ton of blood here. This can be 1v1. We'll take care of it like that. He says, if he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. Essentially, again, it's an ultimatum, 1v1, winner takes all. He continues. He says, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And when you're afraid, you might use words similar to dismayed and terrified. And the Israelites, they were facing this guy who's a lot bigger than them, a lot stronger than them. Even though there's a lot more of them than there was of him, they were afraid. And they were so focused on the fear that was in front of them. And that leads us to the second thing we know about the giant of fear is that yes, fear is loud, but also fear is distracting. You know this to be true. That when you're afraid, when something is in front of you that causes you to be fearful, it's hard to focus on anything else other than the fear that is right in front of you. And that's why I would argue that fear and focus can rarely coexist. Unless it's the thing that you're afraid of that you're focusing on, it's really hard to focus on anything else. And Goliath makes it even harder to focus on anything else for the Israelites because of what it says next. It says, look, for 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and every evening and took his stand. Over a time period of just over a month, 80 different times, Goliath gives this same rant, this same challenge, this same ultimatum, and scares the Israelites in the same way. He does it consistently, and I think that's why it shows us. Now, the third thing that's true about the giant of fear is that fear is consistent. When you're afraid, you know that fear that you have, sometimes it comes around every day, sometimes it's every week, every month, or maybe it's when you remember something every year and it comes right back around every single year. So that is Goliath. And that is the giant of fear. But what about David? We've got another character in the story, and David's over here. What we know about David is that he's a young man, and he's one of the younger of several brothers. In fact, we know that some of his brothers were actually in the Israelite army facing off against the Philistines at this point in time. David's dad was named Jesse, and one of David's jobs was actually to take care of his father's sheep. He was a shepherd. One of the other jobs, though, that Jesse gave David was to deliver food out to the war zone to his brothers to take care of them. So we know of at least one time that David is bringing out food to his brothers, and he sees the Israelites standing still, and he hears Goliath making this rant, and he's like, you can't let them talk to you like that. See, David looks up to these soldiers because he knows that one day he would be one of them as well. And he looks at them and he's like, why are you not doing anything? Are you going to let him talk about our nation like that? Are you going to let him talk about our God like that? Well, David decides that he's going to do something about this. Well, King Saul hears about this plan and he's like, no, 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 this is a disaster. And so we read this little interaction between David and King Saul. And King Saul tells David, he says, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're just a young man. And he has been a warrior from his youth. Essentially saying that, David, you've got your whole life ahead of you. And this Goliath guy, he's been training for this his whole life. Well, David does something pretty incredible here. And he recalls times in his life where he's faced danger. And as a shepherd, his job wasn't just to keep the sheep in one area, but it was to keep them safe. And he talks about times that he fought a bear and times that he fought a lion and how he overcame those. But his response to King Saul is so moving. It's so powerful. Here is what David says. It says, the Lord who rescued me, not my strength, not my talent, not my experience, not my abilities. It wasn't me. It was the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. He will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. And too often as we read this story or as we hear this story, we move right past this and get to the point where Saul tries to give him all this armor and David's like, no, I can't wear all that. I'm not used to it. And so David goes out and grabs some stones, gets a sling that he's used to as a shepherd used to using. But we move past something incredible here. In fact, I would say that we move past the fact that the first thing David reached for, it wasn't his weapon. The first thing David reached for wasn't his weapon. The first thing David reached for was his faith. It wasn't what he was going to physically use to defeat Goliath. It was who was with him. He knew was with him. That made all the difference. And I think that's why what we see in this interaction, what we see in David, we see an incredible example of faith. And because of David's example, the way that we would define faith is confidence or knowing without a shadow of a doubt that God is who he says he is and that God will do all that he promises to do. That is what made the difference in this story. That is what turned the tide in the story. That is the difference. So, we got David and the Israelites. We've got Goliath and the Philistines. The battle is set and the winner takes all. Here's the interaction between David and Goliath. David, talking to Goliath, says, you come against me with sword, with spear, with javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and I'll cut off your head. What he says here, though, is so fascinating. He says the Lord will do this. It's not me. It's not my experience. It's not this army behind me. It's the Lord that will do this. We read on. It says, this very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and to the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. We continue. It says, all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. In this interaction, there's two decisions that David makes here that changes the entire outcome of the story. The first decision is that David decided to keep his focus on God. David could have easily said that I can take you by myself, or this army can take you by themselves. But that's not what David did. David kept his focus on God and who he was and in what he promises that he can and will do. Second thing that David did was David recognized that the battle is the Lord's. I mean, look at what David said. He said, there is a God in Israel. There is a God with me now, and the battle, it's not mine. So I'm not worried about it. He said, there is a God in Israel, and the battle is his. The truth that David knew in this moment is that there is a God that is with him, and a God that is for him, and a God that is on his side. And that alone is the reason that he was able to go out and defeat the Goliath and ultimately defeat the giant of fear. See, David's faith was in God. God was the object of his faith. The Israelites, on the other hand, all they could think about was themselves and what they could do and what they couldn't do, what they were capable of and what they were incapable of, their strengths and their weaknesses. The Israelite army looked at themselves and they said, there's no way we can do this. And that's why I think, not to oversimplify things, but ultimately I think all fear is the result of misplaced faith. See, fear is the result of misplaced faith. And when you fall into the trap that the Israelites fell into, when you look at yourself and you see how you can defeat the giant of fear in your life, and that's all you look at and that's all you see, you fall into the same trap that the Israelites fell into, and you reach for your weapon. When you're afraid, your response is to reach into what you have at your disposal physically. Maybe for you, when you're afraid, when you experience fear, you reach for a bottle in hopes that it takes away the focus of what's going on in front of you. Maybe for others of you, it's a pill that you hope will take your mind off of what you're afraid of. For others of you, maybe it's a relationship that you know is not healthy for you. It's not healthy for your family. It's not healthy for anyone, but it's comfortable and it keeps you shielded from what you're afraid of, at least for a time. See, the most ineffective thing we can do when it comes to the fear in our lives is to reach to what we have at our disposal physically. But when you choose to have faith like David, because I can guarantee you, David was afraid. David was afraid. But he knew who was with him and who was for him and who was on his side. And when you realize that God is with you and that God is for you and God is on your side and you reach for your faith, that makes all the difference. See, ultimately, I would say to sum all this up is that faith is the thing that uproots the fear that we have. And I get it. It would be great if we could just end the message here on that note and go home, be with our families, go to lunch, go on our way. It'd be great if we could just end right there. But you know this to be true. That even when you feel like you've overcome one fear, there's always another fear. There's always something else that comes up in your way. But when we choose to make God the object of our faith, He equips us with the courage that we need to overcome that fear, to move past that obstacle, and to move forward in life. See, I would argue that the amount of courage you have to face the fear in your life is directly related to the object of your faith. And when God is the object of your faith, you're able to much more effectively move past that fear. For some of you in the room, maybe you're not following Jesus yet, or you're not sure about this whole Jesus thing. I'd love to talk to you for just a second. Because if I'm being completely honest, I don't know how you move past the fear in your life. I don't know how you overcome the giant of fear that you face. Because to me, there is no other way to face the giant of fear in my life than with the creator of the universe with me and for me and on my side. Now, for those of you who would say that you are a Jesus follower and that you've been following Jesus for a while, you say that your relationship with Jesus is great. Jesus never promises that we will move through life without fear. In fact, in one instance in the Gospel of John, an account of Jesus' life, Jesus is having this interaction with his disciples, his closest followers. And he's like, guys, I don't think you get it fully. And he says, look, in this life, in this world, you will experience trouble. You will have fear. Things in your life will not always go as planned. But the best news is what he shares next, is that we can take heart or take courage because he has already overcome the world. In other words, he has already overcome through his death and his resurrection. He has overcome sin and death, what we fear most. And in my experience in student ministry, I've done this for almost 10 years now. And I can tell you, I've talked to countless students, parents, families who've been frozen, who've been paralyzed, and who've been fighting fear for a long time. What I can tell you is that if we as adults can get this right, if we as adults can figure out how to effectively fight the giant of fear in our life with the creator of the universe on our side, if we can do that, then it's my hope and what I know without a shadow of doubt that we could turn the tide of an entire generation that is so dominated by fear, that's coming up in a world that is so dominated by fear. That's my hope. See, when we embrace faith, God equips us with the courage we need to face that fear in our life and then to take action. And that is the key to having a heart like David's, a fearless heart. Will you pray with me? God, I don't know what I would do without you. I don't know how I could face the giant of fear in my life, the things that I'm afraid of, without you, the creator of the universe, on my side. Father, every day I pray that you would show me my dependence of you. And that as a church, that everyone in this room would find and see their need for you in their life. And that as we face fear, and we will face fear, God, that as we face fear, we would remember that you are who you say you are. You have shown yourself faithful time and time again, and that you will do all that you promise to do. We believe that is the kind of God you are. And I pray that this morning, someone, maybe even for the first time, would choose to tap into the courage that you equip us with when they experience fear. God, we thank you for who you are. We thank you for your faithfulness. We pray all this in your son, Jesus' name. Amen.